The Colorado Rockies had never faced such a severe winter. Snow fell in abundance, transforming the landscape into an immense white fabric that covered everything it touched. Amid that frozen immensity, a small wooden cabin bravely resisted against the fury of nature. Matthew Oliver, a man in his early 40s, observed through the foggy window the white spectacle forming outside. His eyes, deep green like the forest that surrounded him during summer, carried the experience of someone who chose to live far from civilization for reasons he preferred to keep to himself. "It's going to get worse before it gets better," he muttered to himself, rubbing his graying beard while observing the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The cabin was simple but functional. A stone fireplace kept the environment warm, while wooden shelves sustained books worn by time and use. In the improvised kitchen, an old kettle whistled, announcing that the water for tea was ready. Matthew moved away from the window and walked to the wood stove. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, a familiar sound that in a way comforted him. It was the only noise besides the crackling of the firewood and the howl of the wind that managed to penetrate the thick walls of the cabin. 5 years, he said, serving himself hot tea. 5 years in this place, and I've never seen a storm form so quickly. He had moved to the mountains after the painful breakup of his marriage with Helen. Life in the big city had become too suffocating, the memories too heavy to carry. Here in the isolated cabin he built with his own hands, he found a peace he never imagined possible. Peace that now seemed threatened by a strange premonition. He looked at the old clock on the wall. 4 in the afternoon, and the sky was already almost completely dark. He needed to collect more firewood before the storm worsened. He put on his thickest coat, pulled on his boots, and adjusted the wool beanie over his dark hair. Upon opening the door, the blast of freezing wind almost knocked him down. The snow already reached his ankles, and the cutting cold penetrated to the bone, even through the various layers of clothing. Matthew took a deep breath and headed toward the woodpile covered by a tarp beside the cabin. That's when he noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow, large, irregular, forming a pattern he couldn't recognize. They weren't from wolves, nor mountain lions, nor any animal he knew from the region, and he knew them all. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, crouching down to examine them better. The marks seemed to have been made recently, but the wind was already beginning to erase them. Matthew felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something wrong with those footprints, something he couldn't explain. The silence around was disturbing. Normally, even during storms, he could hear the rustling of trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, the small noises that indicated that life continued despite the cold. But now, there was only the wind. An artificial silence, as if all life had been sucked from the forest. He collected the wood quickly, piling it in his arms while keeping his eyes alert to his surroundings. The sensation of being watched grew with each second. When he finally returned inside the cabin, he locked the door with more force than necessary. "I'm getting paranoid," he said to himself, trying to push away the uneasiness. But looking out the window once more, he was certain he saw movement among the snow-covered trees, something large, dark, moving irregularly. And then the silence was broken by a sound he had never heard before. A howl. But it wasn't the familiar howl of the region's wolves. It was something deeper, more primitive, something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The storm was just beginning, and Matthew sensed that it wouldn't be just the snow that would make this night the longest of his life. The night advanced with frightening speed, while the temperature plummeted to dangerous levels. Matthew fed the fireplace with the freshly collected wood, trying to push away the feeling of restlessness that had been haunting him since he saw those strange footprints. The howl sounded again, now closer, and he felt every hair on his body stand on end. Instinctively, he looked at the rifle hanging on the wall above the fireplace. It was an inheritance from his grandfather, used mainly for hunting in emergency situations. He had never needed it to defend himself. "It must be just the wind," he murmured, not believing his own words. He took another sip of his now lukewarm tea when a different noise caught his attention. It was a low sound, almost inaudible with the noise of the wind, but unmistakable to his ears trained by isolated life in the mountains. Something was moving near the cabin. He cautiously approached the window, pulling back the improvised curtain just enough to see outside. The darkness was almost total, but the white surface of the snow reflected the little light that came from inside the cabin, creating a contrast that allowed him to discern shapes. And what he saw left him momentarily speechless. A pack of red wolves had gathered in front of his door. 5, maybe 6 animals, their slender bodies visibly trembling under the snow that fell mercilessly. But it wasn't the presence of the wolves that surprised him. He had spotted these animals in the region before, although they generally kept at their distance. What intrigued him was their behavior. The wolves weren't acting like predators in search of food. They were grouped defensively as if seeking protection. And then Matthew saw the reason. The alpha female, with more vivid reddish fur than the others, was lying in the snow, her flank marked by a dark stain that could only be blood. "What the hell happened to you?" he whispered, observing with renewed attention. The wolf's wound didn't seem to be the result of a fight with other animals. It was something different, a deep and irregular cut, as if it had been made by a blade, or claws that didn't belong to any creature known in these mountains. Matthew ran his hand over his face, undecided. His rational mind told him to let nature take its course. Wolves are wild animals, unpredictable, but his instincts screamed that something very wrong was happening on this night. Another howl cut through the silence, this one definitely not coming from the pack at his door. It was the same disturbing sound from before, closer now, and Matthew noticed how the wolves cowered when they heard it, as if they recognized a threat. "What's hunting you?" he asked, more to himself than to the animals. The decision was made on impulse. If the wolves were fleeing from something, that something was probably dangerous for him too. Better to have the animals as unlikely allies than as one more threat in the night. With a calculated movement, he unlocked the door and opened it just enough for the animals to enter, if they so chose. The icy wind immediately invaded the cabin, extinguishing some candles and making the fireplace flame dance dangerously. The wolves hesitated. Their wild eyes reflected the light coming from inside, creating an almost ghostly image against the white background of the snow. It was the alpha, who took the initiative, dragging herself with effort into the cabin. The others followed, maintaining a respectful distance from Matthew. "Easy," he said, closing the door as soon as the last wolf entered. "I won't hurt you." The pack settled near the fireplace, their trembling bodies gradually relaxing with the heat. Matthew kept his distance, observing with fascination and a little apprehension the unusual behavior of the animals. The alpha female stared at him with evident intelligence in her yellowish eyes. There was something in that gaze that transcended the barrier between human and wild animal, a mutual understanding, a recognition that both were facing a common threat. Slowly, Matthew approached her, speaking in a low and constant voice so as not to frighten the other wolves. He needed to examine that wound, understand what could have caused such damage. "Let's see what happened to you," he murmured, crouching down cautiously. The wolf didn't try to attack him, just observed attentively as he examined the cut on her flank. It was deep with irregular edges, definitely not made by conventional teeth or claws. It had an almost geometric shape, as if it had been engraved in her skin. Matthew felt a shiver running down his spine. That wasn't natural. When the strange howl sounded again, even closer to the cabin, all the wolves rose in alert, growling low at the door. Matthew's instinct screamed in agreement with that of the animals. There was something out there, something dangerous. Something that shouldn't exist in these mountains, and it was approaching. In the city of Denver, almost 200 miles from Matthew's isolated cabin, a middle-aged woman stared out the window at the rain that fell incessantly. The coast wasn't under the same snowstorm as the mountains, but the tempest was equally intense. Helen Mitchell sighed, mechanically pushing strands of dark brown hair from her face. Her eyes, of an intense amber, seemed lost in distant memories. On the table in front of her, an open folder displayed old photographs and documents yellowed by time. 5 years, she murmured, touching one of the photos where she appeared alongside Matthew both smiling in front of a waterfall in the mountains. 5 years without news. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Helen answered, immediately recognizing the deep voice on the other end of the line. "You were right, Mom," said Philip, a researcher she had hired. "I found strange records in the region where your ex-husband is living. Events that weren't explained." "What kind of events?" asked Helen, feeling her heart accelerate. "Disappearances, animals found with inexplicable injuries, and there's a curious pattern. Everything happens during intense snowstorms, like the one hitting the region now." Helen closed her eyes for a moment. The pieces were beginning to fit together, confirming what she had already suspected since finding her grandfather's old diaries stored in the attic of the beach house she had inherited. "Philip, I need you to come here. I have something to show you." While waiting, Helen turned her attention to the diaries. Her grandfather, August Mitchell, had been a respected ethnographer, dedicating his life to the study of Native American legends and myths. It was in his notes that she found the first references to the Winter Guardian, a being that, according to the legends of the indigenous peoples of the Colorado Rockies, awakened only during the most severe winters. The illustrations in her grandfather's notebooks showed a tall being with disproportionate limbs and sharp claws. But the most disturbing were the symbols that the creature supposedly left marked on its victims, symbols identical to those that Matthew had mentioned in his recurring nightmares, years before deciding to isolate himself in the mountains. The sound of the doorbell interrupted her thoughts. Philip had arrived, carrying a folder full of documents and a worried look on his face. "The storm is getting worse," he commented, removing his soaked coat. "The roads to the mountains have already been closed." Helen felt a tightness in her chest. "We need to get there, Philip. Matthew is in danger and doesn't even know it." The researcher looked at her seriously. "There's something you haven't told me, isn't there? About the real reason why your ex-husband went to live isolated in the mountain." Helen hesitated, but it was time to reveal the truth. Walking to a bookshelf, she removed a carved wooden box and placed it on the table. "This belonged to Matthew's family for generations," she explained, opening the box. Inside rested an ancient medallion made of a dark metal that seemed to be neither silver nor bronze. In the center of the medallion, the same symbol that appeared in her grandfather's diaries had been engraved with frightening perfection. "Matthew's family were always the guardians," continued Helen. "For centuries, his ancestors protected this medallion, believing it was the key to keeping the creature dormant." Philip examined the object with scientific curiosity, but also with evident discomfort. "And you think these myths have some real foundation?" 5 years ago, Matthew began having nightmares, Helen explained, her voice trembling slightly. He dreamed of a creature that chased him in the snow, leaving symbols in its wake. He would wake up screaming, talking about marks on his skin, about a cold that came from within. She paused, recalling the suffering of the man she had once deeply loved. The doctors diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, a result of the accident in the expedition he led years before, but I knew it was more. When I found my grandfather's diaries, I understood that somehow Matthew was connected to this creature. "And that's why he fled to the mountains?" questioned Philip, trying to understand. "No," answered Helen with sadness. "He fled because I didn't believe him. I thought they were just delusions, that he needed psychiatric treatment. Our separation was terrible." She approached the window again, observing the storm that seemed to grow stronger every minute. "Only after he left did I find this information, and now, with the worst snowstorm in decades hitting the mountains," Philip completed the thought, "if the legends are true, the creature has awakened. And Matthew is exactly in its territory," concluded Helen, her voice laden with concern. "With the only object that can stop it." The medallion on the table seemed to pulse with its own energy as the storm increased outside. Helen made a quick decision. "We're going to need a helicopter. It's the only way to reach the mountains with the roads closed." Philip looked at her with skepticism. "In this weather? No pilot would accept." "I know someone who will," affirmed Helen with determination. "Someone who also has accounts to settle with the past. As she prepared to leave, Helen cast a final look at Matthew's photograph. Time was running out and she needed to try to fix the mistake she had made years ago. Or not just Matthew, but perhaps the entire region would be at the mercy of something that should not have awakened. The wind howled furiously around the cabin, as if trying to tear its foundations from the frozen ground. Matthew had improvised a bandage for the alpha wolf, using his limited experience with first aid. The animal now seemed calmer, lying near the fireplace while the other members of the pack remained alert, their eyes occasionally turning to the Torataosier. "Whatever did this to you, it's not of this world," murmured Matthew, observing the strange pattern of the wound. He got up and went to a wooden shelf where he kept his books and some personal items. Pushing aside some dusty volumes, he removed a small box that he hadn't opened in years. Inside it, a leather notebook with pages yellowed by time contained drawings and notes made by his grandmother, a woman whom other inhabitants of the region considered eccentric, but whom Matthew knew possessed knowledge that went beyond common understanding. He flipped through the notebook until he found a drawing that made his heart race. The same pattern as the wolf's wound, represented with frightening precision in a charcoal stroke made decades before. "It can't be a coincidence," he whispered to himself. One of the younger wolves cautiously approached, sniffing the air around Matthew. There was an almost childlike curiosity in its eyes, something that contrasted with the tension that dominated the environment. "It's all right," Matthew said softly, allowing the animal to approach closer. That's when a noise on the side of the cabin made all the wolves rise in immediate alert. It was a scratching sound, as if something with enormous claws was trying to find an entrance. Matthew felt the blood freeze in his veins. The young wolf growled, its fur bristling while the others formed a protective semicircle around the wounded alpha. The noise continued, slowly moving around the cabin, as if whatever was out there was looking for the entrance. Matthew grabbed his rifle, quickly checking if it was loaded. His hand trembled slightly, not from the cold but from the fear of the unknown that prowled his home. The scratching suddenly stopped, replaced by an even more disturbing silence. Then, something happened that made Matthew question his own sanity. A voice, or something similar to a voice, seemed to emanate from all directions at once. It was a guttural sound, as if something was trying to imitate human speech without really understanding it. The sound almost formed a name. His name. Ma. Thohu. He instinctively backed away, his body pressed against the wall opposite the door. The wolves were growling now, all of them, a chorus of warning against the invisible threat. "What do you want?" Matthew shouted, pointing the rifle at the door, though he knew it was a useless question. The response came in the form of a violent impact against the side wall of the cabin, strong enough to make the kitchen utensils fall from the shelves. The wooden structure groaned under the pressure, and for a moment Matthew feared the entire construction might collapse. "Get away," he ordered, though the creature probably didn't understand human words. In his mind, flashes of long-repressed memories began to emerge. The nightmares that had tormented him for years before his coming to the mountains, the visions of something chasing him in the snow, leaving marks in its wake, the same marks he now saw in the wolf's wound. "It's not real," he murmured, trying to convince himself. It can't be real. But the next impact, even stronger, almost tore the door from its hinges. The wood cracked dangerously, and for an instant Matthew glimpsed something through the crack. A long, disproportionately large claw, of a white so pale it almost blended with the snow outside. The alpha wolf rose with difficulty, limping until she stood beside Matthew. Her yellow eyes fixed on the damaged door conveyed a clear message. They were together against that threat. "You've faced it before, haven't you?" Matthew asked the animal, as if expecting an answer. "It was him who did this to you." The attacks on the cabin ceased as suddenly as they had begun. The silence returned, but it was a silence laden with tension, like the moment of calm that precedes an even greater disaster. Matthew took advantage of the pause to quickly reinforce the door with the few pieces of furniture he had. He pushed the heavy oak table against the damaged entrance, piling chairs and a smaller bookcase on top of it. "This won't hold him for long," he said to himself, adrenaline coursing through his veins. As he worked, his eyes fell on the drawing. In his grandmother's notebook, still open on the small table, there was a note beside the symbol written in tight calligraphy. The Winter Guardian awakens only in the most rigorous winters, when snow isolates everything and everyone. He seeks the medallion and its bearer to complete the cycle interrupted centuries ago. Medallion, Matthew murmured, confused. And then, like an icy wave invading his consciousness, the memory surfaced. The medallion that his family passed down from generation to generation. The medallion that Helen had kept after their separation, believing it to be just a relic with no real value. "My God," he whispered, understanding falling on his shoulders like an unbearable weight. "He's not after the wolves." The animals watched him, tense and alert, as if they understood the gravity of the situation. "He's hunting me." The distorted howl sounded again, closer than ever, and Matthew knew that the long night was just beginning. "Ah, you sure about this, Helen? We're risking more than our lives here." The deep voice of Richard Vance could barely be heard over the roar of the helicopter engines. The man in his early 50s with graying hair maneuvered the aircraft with impressive skill considering the extreme conditions. "We have no choice, Richard," Helen replied, firmly holding the medallion in her coat pocket. "If we don't get her there in time, Matthew will—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The idea of definitively losing the man who was once her husband, even after all the years apart, was unbearable. "I never thought I'd return to these mountains," commented Richard, adjusting the controls while trying to maintain visibility amid the snowstorm. "Not after what happened in the expedition." Helen looked at the tense profile of the pilot. Richard had been the guide of the scientific expedition where Matthew and 3 other researchers nearly lost their lives 5 years ago. The only survivor. Besides Matthew, Richard carried not only physical scars but also the weight of guilt. "It wasn't your fault," said Helen. "No one could have predicted that avalanche." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Avalanche? Is that what you all believed all these years?" The medallion seemed to vibrate in Helen's pocket, as if responding to the pilot's words. A chill ran down her spine, and it wasn't because of the biting cold that infiltrated the helicopter cabin. "What do you mean?" Richard kept his eyes fixed on the white horizon, his hands firm on the controls, but his voice betrayed his internal tension. "I asked Matthew once, years later, if he remembered what really happened that night on the mountain. He said his mind had blocked the memories, that doctors called it a defense mechanism against trauma." The pilot paused, swallowing hard. "But I remember, Helen. I remember everything. It wasn't an avalanche that killed our companions." Helen felt her heart accelerate, a part of her not wanting to hear what would come next, but knowing she needed to. "It was something in the snow," continued Richard, his voice almost a whisper. "Something that moved as if the snow itself was alive. It had claws, long white claws, and it left strange marks on the bodies." "The symbols," completed Helen, feeling the medallion growing increasingly hot against her skin, even through the layers of clothing. Richard glanced at her, surprise stamped on his scarred face. "You know about the symbols?" "It's a long story," answered Helen, removing the medallion from her pocket and showing the emblem engraved on its surface. "But yes, I know the symbols, and I know what we're facing." The pilot turned his attention back to the flight, a heavy silence taking over the cabin for a few minutes before he spoke again. "Why did it let the 2 of us live, Matthew and me?" It was a question Helen had asked herself countless times since discovering the truth in her grandfather's diaries. "Because you 2 are part of something bigger," she finally answered. "Something that began centuries ago, when the first settlers encountered the native peoples of these mountains." She caressed the surface of the medallion with her thumb, feeling each engraving of the ancestral symbol. According to the legends, a pact was made between humans and the Winter Guardian. In exchange for protection during the coldest months, a sacrifice would be offered every 100 years when the most severe winter arrived. "Sacrifice?" Richard repeated, his voice betraying the horror he felt. "Not a human sacrifice," Helen quickly clarified. It was something more symbolic, a ritual involving this medallion. But with time, people forgot the ritual. The meaning was lost. The medallion became just a family relic, passed from generation to generation without its true purpose being understood. Richard adjusted the course of the helicopter, fighting against a particularly strong gust of wind. And now? Now the creature has awakened, seeking to complete the broken pact, answered Helen, her gaze lost in the white immensity below them, and it chose Matthew as the bearer. Why him? Because the medallion belongs to his lineage. For centuries, the responsibility of performing the ritual belonged to his family, even if they themselves no longer knew it. The helicopter shook violently when they entered an area of even more intense turbulence. For a moment, Helen feared they wouldn't be able to continue. "We're reaching the limit of what this machine can face," shouted Richard over the roar of the engines. "If the storm worsens, we'll have to land and continue on foot." Helen nodded, gripping the medallion in her hand. It seemed to pulse, now as if it had a life of its own, responding to the proximity of its destination. "How much time do we have?" Richard consulted the GPS, his face illuminated by the bluish light of the equipment. "If we can maintain this course and speed, maybe 20 minutes to the coordinates of the cabin. Too fast for the creature to notice our arrival. Too slow if Matthew is already in danger," murmured Helen. The pilot glanced at her sidelong, a question hovering in his eyes. After all these years, why risk your life for him now? Helen remained silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the white horizon. When she finally answered, her voice was firm and laden with determination. "Because some bonds never completely break, Richard. Because I abandoned him once when he needed me most, and I won't make the same mistake again." The helicopter continued its course through the storm, while below them, somewhere in the white immensity, a battle for survival had already begun. The silence inside the cabin was almost as oppressive as the storm outside. Matthew moved cautiously to the side window, slightly pulling back the improvised curtain to observe the exterior. The darkness of night, combined with the incessantly falling snow, made it almost impossible to see anything beyond a few yards from the cabin. "Where are you?" he murmured, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air that infiltrated through the cracks in the window. The alpha wolf approached, limping slightly, and sat beside him. There was a strange complicity between them now, as if they shared not just the same fear but also the same determination to survive. "We can't stay here waiting for it to return," Matthew said, more to himself than to the wolf. "We need a plan." He turned his attention to his grandmother's notebook, quickly leafing through the yellowed pages in search of more information. The notes were fragmented, often cryptic, but gradually a story began to form. "The Guardian seeks the symbol," read one page. "Without the ritual, he becomes vengeful, hunting the bearer of the lineage until completing the interrupted cycle." Matthew frowned. Lineage. Ritual. The words echoed in his mind, slowly connecting to fragments of stories his father had told him in childhood. Stories about family responsibilities, about a legacy to be protected. Stories he had always considered mere folklore. One of the younger wolves suddenly rose, ears pointed forward, body tense. The others quickly followed its example, forming a protective barrier around Matthew and the alpha. "What is it? What are you hearing?" asked Matthew, though he knew he would not get an answer. The silence was broken by a sound Matthew never expected to hear at that moment, the distant noise of an engine, a helicopter approaching slowly, fighting against the fury of the storm. "Who?" His question was interrupted by a new impact against the cabin wall, so violent that it made the entire structure shake. The door, reinforced with the table and chairs, began to give way, the hinges coming loose from the aged wood. Matthew backed up, wielding the rifle, while the wolves growled in unison. "Come on, you bastard!" he shouted, a courage born of desperation taking over his body. "Show yourself!" The response came in the form of a new blow, this time against the boards nailed over the back window. The wood gave way with a crack, and the icy wind invaded the environment, bringing with it a gust of snow and something more. A pale claw, long and sharp as an ice dagger, appeared through the opening. Feeling around the interior of the cabin, Matthew didn't hesitate. He aimed the rifle and fired. The shot echoed in the confined space, deafening. The claw retreated, and a sound that resembled a distorted scream came from outside. It wasn't a scream of pain, Matthew realized with a chill, but of fury. "We need to get out of here now," he said to the wolves, as if they could understand him. Surprisingly, the pack seemed to comprehend. The animals regrouped, the alpha leading the way to the door at the back of the cabin, the only one that still remained relatively intact. Matthew hastily grabbed a backpack where he kept essential items for emergencies: flashlight, waterproof, matches, a hunting knife, ropes, and a basic first aid kit. He put on his thickest coat and wrapped a scarf around his neck. The sound of the helicopter was closer now, and for an instant Matthew considered waiting for rescue. But the next thud against the side wall of the cabin, strong enough to make part of the structure give way, eliminated that possibility. "Let's go," he shouted, unlocking the back door. The icy wind and snow greeted them like a white wall, almost impenetrable. The alpha wolf was the first to exit, followed by the other members of the pack. Matthew hesitated just long enough to grab his grandmother's notebook and store it in his backpack before following the animals into the darkness. The cold was much more intense than he had anticipated. The snow already reached his knees in some places, making each step a struggle. Visibility was almost zero. Without the light coming from the cabin, it would be impossible to see more than a few yards ahead. The wolves, however, seemed perfectly adapted to these conditions. They moved with surprising agility, forming a path in the deep snow that Matthew could follow. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, his voice almost lost in the roar of the wind. The answer never came, but he continued following the pack, trusting the animal's instinct. The noise of the helicopter was now directly above them, but with the snow falling heavily, it was impossible for them to be spotted from above. It was then that Matthew heard it. The same guttural sound, that distorted imitation of a human voice, now repeatedly calling his name. The creature had left the cabin and was now following them. "Faster!" he encouraged the wolves, forcing his own steps despite the fatigue that was already beginning to settle in his muscles. The pack led him through the snow-covered forest, between pine trees whose branches bent under the weight of ice. Matthew realized they were following a pattern, not simply fleeing randomly. The wolves were taking him somewhere specific. After what seemed an eternity of struggling against the snow and wind, they reached a more open area, where the storm seemed less intense. In the center of the clearing, a rock formation rose from the snow like a silent sentinel. The wolves stopped in front of the rock, now clearly waiting for Matthew to do something. He approached, breathless, trying to understand what was special there. That's when he noticed the markings on the stone. Ancient symbols, similar to those he had seen in his grandmother's notebook, engraved on the rocky surface and partially covered by lichens and ice, the same symbol that was on the wolf's wound. Understanding hit him like lightning. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a key to something that his family should have protected for generations. The distorted howl of the creature sounded once more, much closer now, and Matthew knew they had little time. The helicopter still circled above them, almost invisible through the curtain of snow, but close enough for its noise to be clearly audible. Two different paths to salvation, both so close and yet so uncertain. The choice Matthew would make in the next moments would determine not only his fate, but also that of all those who had inadvertently been dragged into this ancient and unfinished story. "I need to find a place to land," shouted Richard, fighting with the helicopter controls, while the storm seemed determined to bring them down. "We won't be able to keep it in the air much longer." Helen gripped her seat, trying to locate any sign of Matthew's cabin through the foggy window. The darkness and snow made the task almost impossible. "There," she suddenly pointed, noticing a faint light that blinked intermittently among the trees. "It could be his cabin." Richard maneuvered the helicopter in the indicated direction, slowly descending while trying to maintain control of the aircraft. As they approached, they could see that the light came not from an intact cabin, but from a partially destroyed structure. "My God," murmured Helen, fear tightening her chest. "We're late." "I'll try to land in that clearing to the east," said Richard, pointing to a less dense area of trees. "It's our only chance." The landing was turbulent, with the helicopter shaking violently before finally touching the snowy ground. Helen didn't wait for the rotors to stop completely. She opened the door and jumped into the snow, sinking almost to her knees. "Helen, wait!" Richard shouted, shutting down the aircraft systems as quickly as possible before following her. "We don't know what's out there." But she was already determinedly advancing toward what remained of the cabin, the medallion in her hand strangely glowing under the faint starlight that occasionally broke through the heavy clouds. The scene they found was desolate. The side of the cabin had been destroyed, as if something extremely strong had torn the wooden boards from the beams. Broken furniture and personal belongings were scattered in the snow, some already almost completely buried by the continuing snowfall. "Matthew!" Helen called, her voice almost lost in the roar of the wind. "Matthew, are you here?" Richard cautiously approached the damaged structure, his flashlight illuminating the dark interior. "There's blood here," he said, pointing to dark stains on the floor, "but it doesn't seem human." Helen crouched to examine the marks, noticing something else beside the bloodstains. "Footprints," she murmured. "Many of them. They look like wolves." Richard nodded somberly. "Red wolves by the shape. An entire pack passed through here. And there's more." He moved the flashlight to the other side of the cabin, illuminating a different set of marks. "These aren't from any animal I know." Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cutting cold. The footprints were large, deformed, as if something that didn't belong to this world had walked there. "We have to follow them," she said, already heading for the back door, which was wide open. "Quickly, before the snow covers them completely." Richard followed her without questioning. Both knew that every minute was precious. The marks led to the heart of the forest, following a winding path among the snow-covered pine trees. Richard's flashlight provided just enough illumination so they wouldn't stumble, but the wind and snow made each step difficult. "Look," Helen pointed to a distant glow among the trees. "It looks like a light." They quickened their pace, driven by the hope of finding Matthew. As they approached, they could distinguish not an artificial light, but a bluish glow that emanated from a rock formation in a clearing. And before the luminous rock, a human figure was kneeling, surrounded by what appeared to be a pack of red wolves. "Matthew!" shouted Helen, running in his direction without thinking of the consequences. The figure turned, and even at a distance, even after 5 years, Helen immediately recognized the man who had once been her husband. His face was more aged, marked by time and hardships, but his green eyes still carried the same intensity that had captivated her from their first meeting. "Helen?" His voice was a mixture of shock and disbelief. "How? Why?" She didn't have time to answer. One of the wolves, larger than the others and visibly wounded in the flank, placed itself between them, growling threateningly. "No," Matthew ordered the animal. "She is not the danger." To Helen's surprise, the wolf retreated, though it kept its eyes fixed on her, distrustful and alert. "What's happening here?" asked Richard, maintaining a respectful distance from the animals. "Why are these wolves with you?" Matthew rose slowly, still apparently not believing what his eyes were seeing. "It's a long story," he answered, "but we don't have time for it now. He's coming." As if confirming his words, a distorted howl echoed through the forest, making all the wolves turn in the same direction, fur bristling and teeth showing. "Did you bring it?" asked Matthew, looking directly at Helen. She nodded, taking the medallion from her coat pocket. "You had this all along?" There was an accusatory tone in his voice. "I didn't know what it was," Helen responded, her voice trembling slightly. "I only discovered the truth recently, when I found my grandfather's diaries." Matthew extended his hand. "I need it, now." Helen hesitated for only a second before handing over the medallion. When their fingers touched during the transfer of the object, an electric current seemed to run through both, a physical reminder of the connection they had once shared. The medallion glowed intensely upon touching Matthew's palm, as if recognizing its true bearer. He raised it, examining the symbol engraved on its surface. It's the same, he said, pointing to the glowing rock behind him, the same symbol. Helen and Richard approached to see better. On the surface of the stone, deeply engraved, was the same design that adorned the medallion, a complex spiral intertwined with shapes resembling ice crystals. "The portal," murmured Helen, recalling the descriptions in her grandfather's diaries. "This is where the ritual must be performed." The howl sounded again, much closer now, and the wolves formed a defensive circle around the three humans. "We don't have much time," said Matthew, looking at Helen with a mixture of emotions in his eyes. "But before we face this, I need to... Oh, why now? After all these years..." Helen swallowed hard, knowing that the answer she would give could change everything between them. "Because I never stopped caring," she finally answered. "And because some responsibilities are too great to be carried alone." Before Matthew could respond, a deafening crash shook the clearing. Trees of considerable size were knocked down at the edge of the forest, as if something huge and incredibly strong was forcibly opening a path. The alpha wolf let out a deep growl, positioning itself at the front of the pack. The other wolves followed, forming a line of defense. Matthew raised the medallion, which now pulsed with its own light, glowing in synchrony with the symbols on the rock. "The time has come," he said, his voice acquiring a strength that Helen hadn't heard in years, "to end this once and for all." The air in the clearing seemed to freeze, not just from the intense cold of the snowstorm, but from something more, an ancestral presence that emanated from the dark forest ahead of them. The snow now fell in chaotic swirls, forming patterns that defied the laws of physics, moving against the wind as if it had a will of its own. "He's here," whispered Matthew, the medallion vibrating in his hand. Helen approached him, positioning herself at his side. "How does the ritual work?" she asked, trying to keep her voice firm despite the fear that threatened to dominate her. "I don't know exactly," answered Matthew, his eyes fixed on the forest, "but something in me knows, as if it were part of my blood, of my deepest memories." Richard kept the flashlight aimed at where the last pine trees had been knocked down, his face marked by tension. The alpha wolf let out a deep growl, advancing a few steps ahead of the group, as if challenging the darkness. It was then that they saw it. Emerging from the forest, as if it were part of the snow itself, the creature rose almost 10 feet above the ground. Its body was slender, disproportionately elongated, with arms that nearly reached the ground. The skin had the perfect whiteness of freshly fallen snow, with bluish veins visible through it, pulsing like frozen rivers. But it was the eyes that most terrified. 2 orbs of a blue so deep, they seemed to suck in all the light around, fixed on Matthew as if nothing else existed in the world. "The Winter Guardian," murmured Helen, her voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head slightly to the side, as if curious. Then slowly it raised an arm, pointing one of its long claws directly at the medallion in Matthew's hand. "It recognizes it," said Matthew, feeling the object pulse more intensely. "It knows why we're here." The alpha wolf growled again but didn't advance. It was as if she understood that this was a battle that couldn't be won with teeth and claws. "Ma! Thew!" The guttural voice of the creature sounded like breaking ice, an imperfect imitation of human speech that made everyone shudder. "Me." Richard took a step back, instinctively seeking distance. "It's speaking. How is that possible?" "It absorbs," answered Helen, recalling what she had read in her grandfather's diaries. "Absorbs knowledge, memories, from its victims." The creature advanced a step, the snow moving around it as if it were an extension of its body. The wolves retreated except the alpha, which maintained its position, though its fur was completely bristled. Matthew felt something strange happening inside him. Memories that weren't his began to flow in his mind. Images of ancient rituals performed in that same clearing, of generations of men and women of his lineage maintaining the pact with the creature. It was as if the blood in his veins carried not just life, but also inherited knowledge, awakened by the proximity of the Guardian and by contact with the medallion. "I know what to do," he said suddenly, his voice sounding strangely calm even to his own ears. Helen looked at him with concern. "Matthew, are you sure? What are you feeling?" "Memories," he answered, his eyes now fixed on the pulsing medallion. "Not mine, but those who came before. The ritual is a renewal of the pact. The Guardian protects the mountain and its inhabitants during winter in exchange for recognition and something more." "Something more?" repeated Richard, his gaze nervously alternating between Matthew and the motionless creature. "Blood," Matthew answered simply. "The blood of the medallion bearer, not as sacrifice, but as a symbol of commitment, of connection with the land." The creature let out a low sound that could be interpreted as approval. Its deep blue eyes hadn't left the medallion for even a second. "No!" exclaimed Helen, grabbing Matthew's arm. "There must be another way. I won't let you hurt yourself." Matthew looked at her with an expression that mixed determination and a nostalgia that spanned the 5 years of separation. "It's not a choice, Helen. It's a responsibility that my family ignored for too long. The result is here," he gestured. "To the storm around them, to the creature before them. The imbalance needs to be corrected." The alpha wolf, as if understanding what was about to happen, slowly backed away, returning to join the pack. Richard also retreated, gently taking Helen with him. "He needs to do this," said the pilot, his gaze revealing that somehow he also understood the necessity of the ritual. Matthew approached the glowing rock, the medallion trembling violently in his hand as he decreased the distance. When he stood before the stone, he could clearly see that the symbol engraved on its surface wasn't identical to that of the medallion. It was its counterpart, designed in such a way that, when correctly positioned, they would form a complete whole. Without hesitating, Matthew pressed the medallion against the rock, fitting it perfectly into the engraving. A bluish light exploded from the point of contact, so intense that for a moment it illuminated the entire clearing as if it were day. The creature emitted a high-pitched sound, almost a song, raising both arms to the stormy sky. The snow around began to move in perfect spirals, rising from the ground in hypnotic whirlwinds. "The portal is opening," murmured Helen, watching fascinated as the light from the rock intensified even more. Matthew knew what would come next. With a quick movement, he pulled the hunting knife from his belt and made a precise cut in the palm of his hand. The blood flowed, bright red against the white of the snow, dripping onto the medallion and the rock. The moment the first drop of blood touched the medallion, the light exploded in a vertical ray that reached the sky, tearing through the heavy clouds. The storm seemed to hesitate, as if a greater force was taking control over it. The creature now approached, its movements as fluid as water running over stones. It stopped before Matthew, its deep blue eyes finally leaving the medallion to look directly at the man. "Pa, Sat," murmured the guttural voice, as one of its long claws extended toward the blood still flowing from Matthew's hand. Time seemed to have frozen in the clearing. Helen watched, with a tight heart, as the creature's claw gently touched the blood on Matthew's extended hand. At contact, the red liquid glowed with its own light as if each drop contained a small star. The creature closed its eyes for a moment, its entire body vibrating at a strange frequency. When it reopened them, something had changed. The deep blue that before seemed empty and threatening now carried a spark of recognition, almost of humanity. "Oliver," it spoke, its voice still distorted, but now clearer, as if it were recovering. Command of human language, broken lineage, interrupted cycle. Matthew maintained his position, though it was visible the effort he made not to retreat. The blood continued to flow from his hand, now dripping onto the snow, each drop creating a small luminous circle that expanded before disappearing. "I am the last," he responded, uncertain if the creature truly comprehended his words. "The last. Who carries the name and the blood?" The creature raised its head slightly, as if it were smelling the air. Its eyes moved briefly to Helen, then to Richard, before returning to Matthew. "Not last," it said, pointing to Helen with its free claw. "She carries future." Helen felt a shiver run down her spine. Instinctively, her hand touched her own belly, an almost imperceptible gesture, but one that didn't escape Matthew's attentive eyes. "Helen," he asked, his gaze now fixed on her, a mixture of confusion and hope on his face. She hesitated, swallowing, hard before finally speaking. "I found out a week after you left," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. "I tried to find you, but you had completely disappeared." "A child?" Matthew's voice was almost a whisper. "We have a son," completed Helen, tears now freely running down her face. "Theodore. He's 4 years old now." The revelation seemed to have shaken Matthew more deeply than the encounter with the ancestral creature. His face, previously determined, now showed vulnerability, a mixture of shock, joy, and a profound sadness for the lost years. "Why didn't you tell me? Why are you only telling me now?" Helen took a step forward, ignoring the danger represented by the guardian, who now observed the exchange with what seemed to be curiosity. "Because I was afraid," she admitted, "afraid that you wouldn't believe me, that you'd think it was just a strategy to bring you back. And later, when I found my grandfather's diaries, the fear changed. I feared for you, for Theodore, for what this connection with this could mean for our son." The creature emitted a low sound, almost like a human sigh, interrupting the moment. "Cycle continues," it said, its claw still lightly holding Matthew's bleeding hand. "But pact needs renewal." The medallion on the rock pulsed with renewed intensity, as if responding to the creature's words. Matthew looked at Helen once more, and she could see in his eyes that a decision had been made. "What is the price of renewal?" he asked, addressing the guardian. The creature released Matthew's hand and pointed to its own forehead, where a symbol identical to that of the medallion began to glow beneath the translucent skin. "Memory," it answered. "Guardian takes memory. Lineage keeps knowledge." Richard, who until then had observed in silence, took a step forward. "It wants your memories?" he asked, his voice betraying concern. "Not all of them," answered Matthew, instinctively understanding. "Just the memories of the ritual, of the pact. That's how it has worked for generations. Each bearer performs the ritual and then forgets, so that the knowledge remains dormant until it's needed again. And so no one tries to manipulate the Guardian's power," added Helen, the pieces fitting together in her mind as she recalled her grandfather's writings. "No one can use what they don't remember exists." Matthew nodded, turning his attention back to the Guardian. "That's why you chose us, isn't it, Richard and me? You didn't spare us in that expedition out of mercy." "Witnesses," confirmed the creature, "always need witnesses." The cold in the clearing seemed to have diminished a bit, as if the Guardian's presence now functioned to protect, not threaten. The snow was still falling, but in a gentler, almost rhythmic way. Helen approached Matthew, lightly touching his arm. "If you complete the ritual, will you forget all this? Everything that happened?" He looked at the medallion embedded in the rock, then at the expectant creature, and finally at Helen. "Just the pact, the Guardian. The rest remains," he answered, though he didn't seem completely certain of this. "In any case, it's a small price to pay for what I received in return." "What did you receive?" she asked, confused. Matthew smiled, the first genuine smile in that entire surreal night. "You hear? The news that I have a son. A chance to start over, Helen. To fix what was broken." The alpha wolf, which until then had kept its distance with the pack, slowly approached. The wound on its flank now glowed with the same bluish light that emanated from the rock and the medallion. It stopped beside Matthew, as if offering its presence as support. "And what happens to them?" asked Matthew to the Guardian, indicating the pack. The creature looked at the wolves for a moment before responding. "Protectors, like you." Matthew nodded, understanding. The wolves, like his lineage, had a role in the natural balance of the mountain. Minor guardians, each with its function. With a decisive movement, Matthew pressed his bleeding hand against the medallion and the rock. The blue light pulsed with renewed intensity, forming a pillar that extended from the clearing to the now partially clear sky. "I accept the responsibility," he declared, his voice firm and solemn. "I renew the pact in the name of my lineage, past and future." The creature inclined its head in reverence, placing its own outstretched hand against Matthew's, separated only by the medallion. The blood flowed between the two, sealing the ancient agreement. The light reached its apex, expanding in all directions before contracting again, converging to the point of contact between man and creature. For a moment, all that Helen and Richard could see was a blinding glow. When the light finally diminished, the Guardian had disappeared. Where the imposing pale figure had stood before, now there was only snow falling gently. The medallion, still embedded in the rock, now seemed like an ordinary piece of ancient metal without any supernatural glow. Matthew remained standing, looking at his own hand, where the cut was completely healed, leaving only a thin silver line in his palm. "Matthew?" called Helen hesitantly, taking a step in his direction. "Are you okay?" He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. For a terrible moment, Helen feared he wouldn't recognize her, that the ritual had taken more than agreed. Then a smile opened on his face, illuminating his tired features. "I'm fine," he answered, extending his hand to her. "Better than I've been in years." Spring came early to the Colorado Rockies that year. What had been an impenetrable blanket of snow just a few weeks ago was now transforming into crystalline streams that wound between pine trees. Life returned to the plateau with an almost celebratory exuberance. At the top of a gentle hill, Matthew's new cabin was almost completed. Larger and more robust than the previous one, it had a wide porch facing the valley and generous windows that captured the sunlight. Richard, who had decided to remain in the region after the events of that extraordinary night, was hammering the last boards of the roof. "I think it will be ready just in time," he commented, descending the improvised ladder to the ground, where Matthew waited with a water bottle. "I hope so," responded Matthew, handing the bottle to his friend before contemplating the construction with evident satisfaction. "They arrive in 3 days." The two men walked to the porch, sitting on the steps to rest. The silence between them was comfortable, as it can only be between people who have shared experiences that go beyond common words. "You really don't remember anything?" asked Richard finally, his voice cautious. Matthew looked at the silver scar on his palm, a habit he had acquired in the last few weeks. "I remember the storm, the cabin being attacked, the wolves," he answered slowly, like someone trying to access a dream in the morning. "I remember you arriving, Helen telling me about Theodore." He paused, slightly furrowing his brow in concentration. "But after that, it's like a fog. I know something important happened, something related to my family, to the mountains, but the details escape, like water between fingers." Richard nodded, not entirely surprised. "The doctor in Bailey said it's common to block traumatic memories. Considering what we went through that night, the destruction of the cabin, being lost in the worst snowstorm in decades, it makes sense that your mind filtered some things." Matthew smiled slightly, appreciating the rational explanation his friend offered, though both knew there was more to the story than they could or wanted to admit aloud. "The important thing is that we survived," he said, his gaze traveling across the valley below, where nature was awakening in explosions of green and colorful flowers. "And that I have a second chance." The sound of an engine announced the arrival of a vehicle. Soon a blue pickup truck appeared on the dirt road leading to the property, raising dust as it approached. It parked beside the cabin, and from it descended Philip, carrying a toolbox and some packages. "I brought the new hinges for the back door," he announced, walking to the two men. "And Helen sent this." He handed Matthew a brown envelope. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, recording moments of Theodore's life from baby to his recently completed 4 years. "She organized everything chronologically," explained Philip. "She said you have plenty of time to catch up." Matthew examined the photos with barely contained emotion. The boy had his eyes, the same intense green, but the smile was undoubtedly Helen's. In each image, he could glimpse characteristics and expressions he recognized, whether from himself or his family. "He likes stories," commented Philip, smiling to see Matthew's reaction. "Helen said he has already asked several times about the father who lives in the mountains." Matthew looked up, surprised. "She talked about me to him, even after everything." Philip nodded. "Always. She said you were an explorer, a man who understood the language of nature better than that of men. That one day you would meet when the time was right." Richard placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, a simple gesture of support that said more than words. "Let's finish that back door," he suggested, noticing the emotion Matthew was trying to control. "You still have a child's room to prepare." The three men worked for the rest of the afternoon, completing the last details of the cabin. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, they sat at the new kitchen table for a simple meal. "Helen mentioned that you discussed her and Theodore moving here permanently," asked Philip as they shared a bottle of wine. Matthew nodded, a discreet smile on his lips. "We're taking it slow. First an extended vacation, so Theodore can adapt. Then we'll see. But yes, the idea is for them to stay." "And her work?" questioned Richard. "I thought the research at the university was important. She managed to transfer to the campus in Bailey," explained Matthew. "She'll continue her research on regional ethnography. Apparently, this region is rich in legends and traditions that have been poorly documented." Philip and Richard exchanged a quick glance, which didn't go unnoticed by Matthew. "What?" "Nothing," answered Philip hastily. "I just find it interesting how things fit together sometimes." After Philip left and Richard retired to the small chalet he had built for himself further down the slope, Matthew remained on the porch, observing the first stars appearing in the clear sky. The silence of the mountain, once his only companion, now seemed laden with promises. A movement at the edge of the forest caught his attention. The alpha wolf, its reddish fur gleaming under the rising moonlight, was observing the cabin from a distance. It wasn't alone. The outlines of the pack were visible among the shadows of the trees. Matthew raised his hand in a silent greeting. The wolf slightly inclined its head, its intelligent eyes fixed on him for a moment, before turning and disappearing into the forest with the rest of the pack. Strangely, he felt no fear or apprehension. Just a quiet certainty that this encounter was normal, part of something greater that he couldn't name, but could feel. He took from his pocket a small carved wooden box that Helen had sent him a week after the storm. Inside, the ancient medallion rested on a lining of worn velvet. It didn't seem special now, just a family relic without extraordinary properties. Still, Matthew felt compelled to keep it close, a reminder of something important, even if he couldn't exactly remember what. His cell phone vibrated, announcing a message. It was Helen, sending a recent photo of Theodore, asleep embracing a storybook about forest animals. Under the photo, a simple message. "He's already dreaming of the adventures he'll live with his father. We can hardly wait to be home." Home. The word resonated in Matthew's heart with unexpected force. For 5 years he had searched for a place to belong, without realizing that belonging wasn't in a place, but in the people with whom we share. "Sid?" He responded to the message with few words, letting his heart speak. "We'll be waiting. The mountain has never been as beautiful as in this spring." He put away the cell phone and, with it, the medallion back in his pocket. Tomorrow would be another day of work, of preparations for the new life that was about to begin. The gentle wind that descended from the mountain brought the perfume of wildflowers and moist earth. Matthew breathed deeply, absorbing the familiar aromas and at the same time discovering them anew, as if nature itself was revealing itself in a new light. Before entering the cabin, he looked one last time at the edge of the forest. For an instant, he thought he saw a bluish glow among the trees, like the reflection of the moon on ancient ice. But when he blinked, it had disappeared, leaving only the peace of the spring night. Perhaps it was just his imagination, or perhaps, as Matthew was beginning to suspect, some stories never really end. They just wait like winter snow for the right moment to transform into something new.